This sentence will break your Japanese. See, Japanese verbs are divided into two types, Jidoushi and Tadoushi. These are fundamental concepts you must know to understand Japanese like a native. So to start off, what is Jidoushi and Tadoushi? A Jidoushi is a self-move term, while a Tadoushi is an other-move term. Let's take a look at a few examples of Jidoushi. Ame ga furu, rain does fall. Hana ga saku, flower does bloom. Shiai ga hajimaru, match does start. Note how the subjects perform the action themselves without affecting anything else. Hence the term Jidoushi, self-verb. Next, here are some examples of Tadoushi. Hon o yomu, read a book. Boru o nageru, throw a ball. Arubaito o hajimeru, start a part-time job. Note how the o particle marks the thing affected by the verb. We call this the object. The book isn't reading, someone is reading the book. The ball isn't throwing, someone is throwing the ball. That someone that is doing the action is the hidden zero ga from the first core grammar video linked up here. Since these verbs apply to other objects, they're called ta-doushi, other verbs. Next, some words can be both jidoushi and tadoushi. There are a few situations where this happens, and sometimes it's easy to tell what it is, while other times it isn't. Let's take a look at a few examples. Fuku, as in kaze ga fuku, or fue o fuku. Fusagu, as in ki ga fusagu, and ana o fusagu. These two situations are like Schrodinger's verb. Once you see it in context, it can only be one or the other. Not all jita verbs are this simple. A lot of the times the dictionaries just disagree with each other, and that's how you end up with multiple definitions. But ultimately, as a learner, as long as you're not surprised when you see a word that's both ji and ta, then you don't really need to know the why behind it. Next, let's talk about verb pairs. In Japanese, a lot of verbs have Jidoushi Tadoushi pairs, but not all verbs have pairs. Here are some examples of verbs with pairs. Hajimaru and hajimeru, as in shiai ga hajimaru and arubaito o hajimeru. Ochiru and otosu, as in kaidan kara ochiru, or boru o otosu. Haeru and ireru, as in heya ni haeru and hon o kaban ni ireru. Now, let's take a look at why this is important and how it can help you understand Japanese sentence structure. For this, we'll use the example sentence, hon ga wakaru. Hon means book, and wakaru is usually translated as to understand. Most resources will tell you this means I understand the book. However, this is a huge mistake. If we truly believe this means I understand the book, then we must ask the question, why is hon marked by the subject marker ga instead of the object marker o? And where is I in the Japanese sentence? The common explanation is that ga sometimes marks the object, and that watashi wa is actually hidden here, and the wa particle sometimes marks the subject. But if I said hon wa wakaru instead, they would also translate this the same way, and now wa can sometimes also mark the object. So in conclusion, if you follow the above advice, you'll come off thinking that wa, ga, and o can sometimes mark the topic, sometimes mark the subject, and sometimes mark the object. This explanation is not very useful, and this is why people get confused. Here's what's actually happening that these sources don't tell you about. As mentioned in the first video on core grammar, the ga particle only has one function that never changes, and it marks the subject. With this, we can immediately reject I understand the book because I am not the subject. The book is. Next, following the second video on core grammar, we can figure out that this is an A does B sentence. Wakaru doesn't actually mean to understand, but instead means does understandable. Or we can say makes sense. This gives us the final sentence, the book does understandable, or the book does make sense. This all ties back to Jidoushi and Tadoushi, because if you're wondering, well, why can't I just say watashi ga hon o wakaru to literally say I understand the book? This is because wakaru is a Jidoushi. It cannot affect an other object, and thus cannot take the o particle. This is why hon is the subject and applies the verb to itself. Next, let's get a bit more advanced and cover 3 rules that will allow you to tell whether a word is ji or ta. First, if a verb ends on su, it is most likely a tadoshi. We can remember this by thinking of the verb suru, to do something. For example, deru versus dasu, ochiru versus otosu, fueru versus fuyasu. When I was taught this rule by my teacher, the late Kure Dolly sensei, I was told that this rule has no exceptions. However, I found that to be not true. Beginners will not need to know this, but I've written a list of exceptions for all of Dolly Sensei's rules regarding this topic in the extra learning materials available on my Patreon. You will also get access to more examples, deeper explanations, the worksheet for this lesson, as well as all my citations and research for this video. To unlock all this, please consider supporting me at the Kanbu tier on my Patreon by clicking up here or scanning this QR code. Alright, and the next rule is that aru ending verbs that have a pair are usually jidoushi. The most common pair for this are verbs ending on aru and eru. We can remember this by thinking of the verb aru, to exist. Examples: hajimaru and hajimeru, kakaru and kakeru, tomaru and tomeru. Once again, this rule does have exceptions, but it applies for the overwhelming majority of words. The third rule is that most jidoushi cannot take the o particle. Keep in mind, some jidoushi can take the o particle, but they are very consistent and I'll show them later on. So basically, if you run into a case like tsumoru and tsumu where you're not sure which is which, all you need to do is look at an example sentence. Yuki ga tsumotta. Yuki o tsunda. Yuki means snow, so the snow does stacked, or something stacked the snow. This one cannot be a tadoshi because the snow itself is stacking, and this one cannot be a jidoushi because the snow is the other object getting stacked. Now, I mentioned that some jidoushi can take the o particle, so let's take a look at these now. There are certain sentences in Japanese that can go like this. Sora o tobu, hashi o wataru, jidai o ikiru. Actually, this can be very simply explained. Fly the skies, cross the bridge, and live the times. This is only possible when the verb has some sort of movement and the subject moves through a certain space or time. So fly the skies means you flew through the skies. Cross the bridge means you went from here to here and you crossed through it like this. And live the times means you've lived through the times and ages. Now, some people might say, well, if it takes an object, then it's a tadoshi, isn't it? And while yes, the o particle here does mark the cognate object, if you think about it, you're not actually doing anything to the sky, the bridge, or the times. The action only applies to the subject, and thus it is still a jidoushi. Now, some sites will tell you that you can use o in other cases too. To make a long story short, that's not true, and here are a bunch of natives that agree with me. Once again, if you want to see all the arguments for and against this, please check the extra learning materials available on Patreon. One more thing, going back to words that can be both ji and ta, take a look at these two examples. Shinobu, as in 彼が苦痛を忍んだ, and 患う, as in 彼が肺の病気を患った. On the one hand, you can say, these are tadoshi because you're enduring or suffering something. But on the other hand, you can also argue that you're enduring or suffering through something. This is why they are classified as both ji and ta. Next, let's talk about fukugo doushi, or compound verbs. For those unfamiliar, this is when you take one verb and put it into its e stem, then connect it to another verb, forming one compound verb. If you are unfamiliar with the stem system, please watch this video on verb conjugations linked up here. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this because it's a huge can of worms, and I've spent weeks sifting through academic research papers and pulling my hair out. So the short answer is this. Here are all 4 possible combinations you can get, and here are examples of jidoushi and tadoshi results for all 4 combinations. And here's the thing, we can go deeper, but we don't need to. For example, we can say this and this is an exception, that and that is a rule, and in these cases, we look for the dominant verb. Now, if you understood that, great. But practically speaking, all we really need to do is just check if the sentence takes an o particle and whether it's doing some sort of pass-through motion. As long as you remember this one golden rule, that'll apply to everything, including the next point. Next, let's talk about verb triplets. Certain words are able to form triplets like toku, tokeru, tokasu, naku, nakeru, nakasu, fusagu, fusagaru, fusageru, Once again, we can go into a lot of depth with this, but I feel like that'd be a little overwhelming for beginners. So the simple trick is to remember Dolly Sensei's rules. If it ends on s, it's usually tadoshi. If it ends on er, it's usually jidoshi. And if you want to ask, oh, what's the difference between using this as a jidoshi versus this? To be honest, I don't think that'll be a problem in the first place, since if you see this sentence, for example, there's no reason to go, oh, what if I swap this word out? You should just learn it for what it is, and realistically, it won't cause that many problems. This isn't to say we can't explain it, but this just requires a higher level of understanding that isn't expected from beginners. So if you're an advanced learner and want to deepen your understanding of Japanese, click on this video next or subscribe to my Patreon, and if you're a beginner, make sure you watch this video next instead. Cheers!